In just over a decade, the entire baby boom generation will be over 65. That means a lot of employees, talent, and experience heading out of the workforce. Unless there's a change of perspective now to retain and even build that group and the ones coming behind them. Lisa Taylor is co-author of The Talent Revolution, Longevity and the Future of Work, and she's also the founder and president of the research and consulting firm Challenge Factory. Hi, Lisa. It's nice to have you here.
Hi, Nam.
We're going to be talking about why we need a new approach with the book that you've written, which is called The Talent Revolution. When you say talent revolution, what do you mean by that term?
I think when we talk about how work is changing and we think about technology, we think about the technology revolution and how everything is changing. I think when it comes to the world of work and the people working inside of the organization, we need to recognize that there is equally a revolution that is taking place that will have just as big an impact as technology in how demographics are actually changing our world of work.
And who do you think should be paying attention to this, the workers themselves or the people that do the hiring?
I think everyone needs to pay attention to it. I think workers themselves feel it. They feel what it feels like to be in a career, or in a path, or in a company that no longer seems to be interested in them, and yet they still have so much to give. And at the same time, intergenerational relationships are, being discussed all the time, but from a personal perspective of how it feels. Smart organizations will recognize that this isn't just dissonance, this isn't just getting close to a large population being ready for retirement and how do we plan for succession and what happens through the rest of the workforce. This actually is a revolution of where there are extra decades of productivity, and our corporate structures are not set up to be able to maximize on the full value that our workforce can be providing us.
And you mentioned intergenerational. What do you mean by that? Do you mean like for baby boomers and millennials, or?
So it's interesting that you say that, because we always go to baby boomers and millennials and we forget those poor Gen Xers in the middle.
Hi, we're right
here. Me too. So the real, power of the word intergenerational is that it is different. There's a nuance to it to multi-generation. So a multi-generation looks at how many different generations are there in the workforce and how do we describe them? This generation has this characteristic and that generation has that characteristic. And from my perspective, that's actually not that useful or helpful. Where smart companies will be able to capitalize is in the interplay between the generations, in what's been learned and the experiences that a millennial and a Gen Xer and a boomer have together, and now Gen Z coming into the workplace as well. What's the intersection point that wasn't possible before that is now added value because these generations are working together, as opposed to defining how can we keep them separate or distinct or understand them as if they're unique?
So the commonalities.
And where what one knows plays off on something where someone else knows it. I mean, the workforce is a cycle, they're a system. They all work and reinforce each other. And the more we serve to separate the populations in the workplace, the more we derive value that can really be beneficial.
Well, we used to refer to climbing the corporate ladder, smashing that glass ceiling. Why is an escalator a better metaphor for how careers currently function?
I think the corporate ladder gives a description of how you would move up in your career in terms of level and progression. A talent escalator is something that everyone is on, where the ride is not so much because you're moving up through promotion and becoming more and more senior in an organization, but it's the amount of time that you're spending in the organization. So the talent escalator operates to say you get onto the escalator at the bottom, you move up in time as you spend time in organizations and in your career as you ride that escalator. And one of the key critical factors that's actually a catalyst for some of the changes that are taking place in the future of work is the fact that as you hit that fifth step on that escalator, fifth floor or sixth floor of the escalator's ending, and you still have so much farther to go.
But there's nowhere to go.
Now what do you do?
Right.
And people are finding that they have a choice, right? They can step off this structure that they've been on, employment, whether they're forced off or whether they choose to come off, and hope that they find their way or find another mechanism to continue to be productive, engaged, and working, or they can ride the top step of the escalator as it disappears under the floor, and every time it disappears under the floor, take a step back and ride that top step as if they're on a treadmill.
Well, I want to read something from the book around, what happens at the end of our careers.
Sure.
You write, every single day from now until 2031, 10,000 Americans will turn 65 and will either have left the organizations they have worked for or will be under pressure to do so. At present, most organizations do not have career paths and talent programs that consider the value of an aging workforce. On the contrary, this cohort is often treated like a failing limb to be humanely amputated. What's more, since the passage of the American Social Security Law in 1935, when the average life expectancy was 61.7 years, employees have spent their working lives accepting 65 as a finish line. If 65 is no longer a finish line, where should the finish line be?
So it's an interesting question of why we need to define a finish line in the first place. So when the finish line was set at 65, as you just mentioned from the quote from the book, life expectancy was only 62. So the finish line was set beyond life expectancy. And yet today we have this idea that we have to have this finish line, this definition of when work is now in our past and we're moving on to a next phase, and it's decades before our physical and mental health will actually require us to start to withdraw or to conclude from the workforce.
Because we're living longer, right?
Because we're living longer. And what I find so fascinating is people generally accept that we're living longer. They'll generally accept that we're working longer. But what that actually means and how do we actually re-architect our entire working society? How do we architect it so that my kids that are teenagers are ready and prepared for careers that'll take them well into their 80s as they live into their hundreds? How do we do that? That's an enormous challenge that's a little bit more than just saying, well, we're going to work a little longer so everyone just needs to stretch what they've been doing.
Well, the Canadian government tried to address this back in 2012 when under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, there was a plan to raise the age at which Canadians qualify for old age security benefits to 67. And there was a lot of pushback on this. Would that move have helped fix the broken talent escalator?
I don't think so. I mean, I think certainly starting to get people to recognize and realize that this finish line of age in your 60s is not appropriate. I think that is something that is a good positive step. I think those kinds of messages are positive. I think the actual implications of taking financial supports that, in the case of the OAS, really serve populations that need significant support and are really counting on that benefit in a short term to all of a sudden make changes, I think that's very difficult for people to react to. I think what we need to be doing from a policy perspective is really taking a look to say, what happens if there is actually no defined finish line? How does that affect the way pensions are actually structured and the other supports that are structured? Who gets left behind and who actually gets advantage from that? And how do we not incrementally change a system? It's not a talent evolution where we incrementally each year move 1 year at a time. How do we go back to first principles and actually spark a revolution that says, what does it mean to have meaningful, engaging work and a workforce that is productive and contributing to our economy for their entire actual working lifespan, not a working lifespan that was defined in the 1930s.
Is that why you see people who might, I don't know, take on freelance work after 65, or like, what do you see happening right now? Yeah,
so within the workplace, ageism is rampant, and I say that as if it's unique to the workplace, but it isn't. It's actually throughout our society. We, as individuals, will make age-based comments all the time. You know, we'll be self-deprecating, we'll make a comment about our age, we'll make a comment about the need for glasses. All of that just reinforces that at a certain period of time, we are no longer the same capable people that we used to be. And it is false. And from an employer perspective, to recognize these age-based myths and biases on what older workers can and can't do or what's appropriate in terms of their engagement levels in your organization, they're costly. And they're based on myth. So we need to be able to change not just hearts and minds from a perspective of it's a good thing to do, it's actually costing our economy in productivity.
We'll talk more about that, but I want to talk more about the language. And in the talent revolution, you write, many mature workers may not yet have realized that the era of company control over career is coming to an end. Or they may think that the emerging pattern of young people taking control of their own careers does not apply to them. As a result, neither the company nor the individual takes any action to move forward. An entire cohort is ignored while capable people mark time. That they become bored or disengaged is to be expected, and this is often attributed simply to aging. It is unlikely that organizations recognize the career potential of this cohort when boomers themselves don't appreciate it. At the very beginning of that section, you used the term, the phrase, mature workers. Why did you use that term?
So terms are tricky when we get into this language because it is so value-laden. So we've used in the book mature workers, we've used older workers. We're actually unapologetic about using the word older workers because they are simply older than younger workers who are simply younger. Although what's interesting to me is what's the definition of mature and maturity? And at what age do you suddenly become mature?
When you're older?
And why is that, right? Why do we actually
yeah.
put that onto the particular cohort where we wouldn't necessarily use that for a younger cohort? The issue of language is one that is addressed in the book, and it's a tricky one that makes it hard to even have these kinds of conversations.
And something that I would never have thought of reading your book, I noticed the phrase digital native. Yes. And why is that problematic to use?
So the term digital native is one that describes the generation that grew up with technology. So they grew up when the internet was actually already implemented in workplaces, and they've grown up using that technology. So it's problematic for two reasons. The first reason is it's often used in job postings as a way to explain what companies are looking for. We're looking for someone who's vibrant, who's creative, who's a digital native. It's code that says if you're over a certain age, you need not apply. It actually is an example of ageism in job postings, which is illegal. If you were to say, if you're over 32, you need not apply, you would never post that. And yet digital native slips through all the time. So you can do that. You can do a search and you can find out who's using that term in their postings. I think the other way that it is also problematic is the assumption that only young people are digitally native. I mean, I grew up in the tech sector. The average age on my team was in their late 40s. They'd been working with technology. They actually invented the digital technologies that we're now saying are for youth. They are just as digitally native as any 20-year-old today. But we don't think about it that way.
That's an excellent point. Being a Gen Xer. You mentioned that internet search for tools to calculate the real costs of employees turned up more than 11 million results. What did you discover about the reliability of these calculators in relation to the cost and value of mature employees?
Yeah, recognizing that some organizations have really robust departments that help them calculate the cost of their workforce, and actuaries and data analysts that are able to give that type of guidance. And in Canada, a lot of companies are small businesses where they're really looking for information on how to do things using online and other tools. They may not have whole departments. We wanted to go and see what tools are out there if we were to actually calculate the cost of the workforce. We hear so much that older workers are more expensive than younger workers. We wanted to go and see what tools are out there to help business owners and employers make decisions about that. So we found that the tools and calculators that are out in the marketplace are chock full of salary, of benefits, of time off, of learning, of all kinds of things. Time to productivity when you onboard someone new, how long will it take before they're actually 100% up to speed? We found lots of information in the calculators that help organizations make decisions around those costs. We didn't see anything in those calculators that valued the experience of having done something before, the efficiency of being able to use past experience to apply it, the ability to mobilize and animate and encourage others around you to have a really positive culture because you love the culture that you've been working in and you're a brand ambassador for it. All of the things that actually capture the value of older workers are not captured in those cost calculators.
You've mentioned the word myths a couple of times, and what you just mentioned about older employees being more costly. What are some of other myths between hiring older people than younger people?
Sure. In the book, we explore 5 myths. One of them is older workers being more costly, but the others look at the myth that older workers are less productive, the myth that there's an actual best before date for workers in terms of their engagement, the myth that older workers, there's no return on investment in training and in continuing to develop older workers, and the myth that there is a difference in the way that you should manage performance by generation, that it's appropriate to have performance management for younger workers, but older workers should really just be left to coast as a kindness. Those are really the 5 myths that are driving all kinds of strategic decisions inside of organizations, and they're not based on what the data shows.
And they're affecting many, many, many people. You mentioned an internet meme that states, our employees are our greatest asset, and the source in the meme, it says, every CEO everywhere.
Every CEO.
When you hear that, it sounds nice, but what do you see as problematic about that?
Yeah, so the intention of our employees being our greatest asset is a good one, but the accounting is wrong. So if you think about what an asset actually is, an asset is something that you acquire for a price, you depreciate it over time, and eventually at the end of its useful life, you write it off for nothing. So in that context, our employees are not assets. We do not look to acquire them, depreciate them, deplenish them, and then write them off for nothing. In fact, smart employers will recognize that employees are equity. They're a value source that you invest in. They grow in that investment over time. And in fact, that return on investment continues even after they've left your organization. I've worked for other companies, and my connection with those companies through my LinkedIn profile, through the way that I'm introduced in different places, I'm still delivering value back through brand recognition to those organizations. I haven't worked there in 20 years. So we need to take a different perspective on what the employee life cycle actually means and where is the value in the relationship between the employer and employee, and it is not based on managing our employees as assets.
In the book, you have this graph that I thought was really interesting. And for anyone listening to the podcast, the title is Career Timelines Have Changed. And you're suggesting that we now have an additional phase in our career that you call legacy careers. And that would be, I guess, between 50 and 75. What are legacy careers?
Yeah, so the actual date or how old you are when you enter into the legacy career period is less important than to recognize that we have different stages of our career. They're tied to life stages. There's good psychological career development principles behind how a person moves through their life stages. Because we're now living for decades longer, it doesn't mean that midlife used to be 20 years and now we have a 50-year midlife. There's actually a new segment of time that has come in between midlife and old age. And that pushing back of life stage and the creation of a new life stage affects everything that we do. It affects how we work and the relationship that we have to work and career. And so we've named that new stage of career, legacy career, because what we're seeing is individuals that are at that stage, whether it's at 45, at 50, at 55, at 72, people get to it at different points in time. But what they're looking for is they're looking to return to work that has meaning. They're looking to spend less time managing people and more time doing things that are with their hands and with their original skill, back to delivering on what they really love to be doing. And they want to know that their work is creating lasting long-term value. That's really what they're looking for, and that's the legacy career period.
So it's not a specific job, but it's about something that they're doing that was part of their career, or something completely new?
It can be both. I mean, it's a 20 to 30 year segment of time. It is enough time that someone can take what did they learn through their foundational career, what did they learn through their mid-career, what do they want to keep with them when they look at how they want to apply their work in the world going forward, and what are they done with? It's okay to say, I've been an accountant for 25 years and I am done with that. And to look out into the world and say, the world of work has really changed. What is it that are my skills, my needs, what I care about, and where the market is, that I actually want to craft something that is the next chapter in my story, but not necessarily the same old story.
Kind of like transferable skills, right?
A bit.
A bit, okay. What is constructive dismissal, and how does it complicate the job of finding the ideal career path for mature workers?
So constructive dismissal is a legal construct, and I'll say I'm not a lawyer, but constructive dismissal is a legal construct that basically means that employers can't change the fundamental aspects of your job. They can't reduce your hours, they can't significantly change your shifts, they can't reduce your salary or your benefits. They also can't change the perception or the status that your job has. They can't change your title without recognizing that they've now changed your job so much that it's as if they have let you go. So constructive dismissal is a term that is used when those kinds of things have happened, employees have experienced it, and now they will sue their employers for constructive dismissal, or they're in a situation of constructive dismissal where the job has changed so much that it's actually not the same job as it used to be.
And how does that impact mature workers?
With mature workers, where there's an interesting intersection point is there certainly are examples of actual constructive dismissal that takes place all the time. Where the interesting new discussion comes into play is if you think about the conditions that I just talked about that someone seeking their legacy career is interested in, managing fewer people, attending fewer meetings, maybe having more flexibility in time, not working the hours that they used to work, shifting the way that they do work to have more flexibility for a different type of life cycle. For those that are in more senior positions, some of that is a pulling back on hours of work, on salary, on title, on status within the organization, because we don't have a career path that says it's actually okay for your career to move through the entire life cycle that we actually have with our longer working lives. So employers are afraid to have conversations with employees as they get closer to the traditional age of retirement, because they're afraid that any discussion about a shift in career could trigger a constructive dismissal situation.
This is such an interesting conversation. We only have a few more minutes, and I want to get a few more questions in. We frequently hear about freelance workers as being, the future of work. What did your research for this book tell you about the growth of the freelance sector?
So that's an interesting comment on the importance of looking at data. So data that's coming out of Canada, out of the US, out of Western economies in Europe, are actually showing that in studies, in census studies and in studies that have counted how many workers are currently in a contractor or freelance model over the last 20 years, the size of the freelance market has actually stayed flat. In Canada, it's insignificantly declined, so just by a tiny, tiny bit, since 20 years ago. So there's a lot of discussion that takes place about freelancers. There's studies that have come out that have said, by 2022, 50% of the American market is going to be in a freelance or contract arrangement. The data's not showing that, though. So I think the interesting piece that we need to dig into there is to get a little more understanding of how do freelance models fit into the future of work. And specifically, there is a difference between the freelancer model and precarious employment. And those things are typically pulled together. They're not the same thing.
Really? Because I thought that we usually hear that people just interchange them. How are they different?
So precarious employment is putting workers in situations where they don't have predictability of where they're going, of how they're going to continue to be able to sustain their own employment. It's, kludging together jobs based on multiple, all precarious contracts that don't have cohesion across the board.
That sounds like freelance work, doesn't it?
But freelance work, if you think about traditionally the way freelancers have worked, we've had people working in a freelance model for a very, very long time. They're still able to sustain long-term contracts. They're able to predict what's going to happen to them one year to the next. They develop relationships. What we need to see, and we're actually starting to see it, is brokerages that help freelancers that are being pushed into a freelance model who don't have the business development skills or the relationship skills to sustain a stable freelance business. That's not their business. They've been pushed into this work arrangement and are now having to be both a skill provider or a subject matter expert and the business developer. That's where we run into this intersection point. And there are new platforms that are coming out that are saying to freelancers, we'll help you take care of finding work. You need to do good work. And so we can really get out of this cycle where being a freelancer has to be precarious. It doesn't.
Is there any, I'm sure there's people watching, their mature workers watching right now, and they might be concerned about their upcoming retirement. What would you say to those people?
I think that, to those people, I would say that the real issue to kind of grapple with a little bit is one of identity. Anyone that's encroaching upon retirement has thought about themselves and the contribution they make, the work that they do, and the company they work for or the industry they work in for a long time. It's been part of how they introduce themselves and how they think about themselves. And so I think in addition to all the new models of working and all the different opportunities and what could you do, and for some people, the fear that there are no opportunities, in addition to that whole dialogue, there's a deeper dialogue of recognizing that this move is not a small one, and it affects the core of how you think about yourself. And how can you start to put yourself in situations that you see an active, productive, forward-facing way to move forward, as opposed to moving forward with something that you can only say, I used to work in broadcasting.
Right.
What's the way that you want to be introducing yourself moving forward? How can you get some good guidance and advice to be able to marry that with where there are actual market opportunities? And how can you make that story true for yourself in the future?
On TV, there are many ways that retirement is portrayed. What do you think of the ways that it is portrayed?
There actually was a study in the US that was done probably 3 years ago now that took a look at commercials and how it portrays different aspects of retirement. And it found that there was a dichotomy. Either sad, lonely, decrepit people that were in all kinds of situations that were quite downtrodden, or affluent, on the beach, living the high life kind of portrayal, which kind of said, if you do it right, this is what you should be, that actually in focus group testing found people to feel pretty bad about themselves, because that's not necessarily reality either. I think the way we portray retirement is really one of those two directions. And the truth of the matter is, it's just a new segment of life. There's ups and there's downs. There's winners and there's losers in every revolution, including the talent revolution. And what we need to be focusing on is what are realistic portrayals so that we don't have people making jokes about what it would be like if someone worked into their 70s with someone who's 70 right next to them and is, killing it on the apps that they're using on their phone.
Well, Lisa, this has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for writing the book.
It's my pleasure.
We appreciate it.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.